Hello everyone, welcome back to the Velvet Murmurs.
Miss Marple and the Vicarage Garden Murder. Chapter 1. A Garden to Die For. St. Mary Mead basked beneath the warmth of a surprisingly generous spring sun. The hedgerows, thick with cow parsley, quivered gently in the soft breeze, and birds chattered with cheerful insistence from budding branches. Along Church Lane, window boxes overflowed with prime roses, tulips and the occasional bold daffodil, while villagers bustled about with baskets, sun hats and half-forgotten umbrellas, just in case the weather turned fickle, as it often did. At the heart of this bucolic peace stood the vicarage, a large ivy-clad building with faded brickwork, leaded windows and a blue-painted front door that creaked slightly on its hinges. The garden beyond was an untamed marvel of late spring color, where neat rows of marigolds danced beside exuberant foxgloves, and a stubborn wisteria clung to the trellis like an old gossip clutching secrets. It was here that Miss Marple, settled on a folding wooden chair near the tea table, quietly observed the gathering of her fellow villagers with polite interest. Her delicate gloved hands rested atop a knitted shawl draped across her lap, and her pale blue eyes, sharp and steady, scanned the scene beneath the brim of a modest straw hat. "Isn't it a picture, Jane?" cooed Dora Willett, a chatty widow with a fondness for elderflower cordial and unprovoked sighs. "Cicely's really outdone herself this year." "Yes," replied Miss Marple calmly, "rather splendid, though I do wonder if those geraniums aren't struggling a little. Perhaps overwatered." Dora blinked at the flower beds. "Oh, you always notice the tiniest things, don't you? You'd think he'd weed the flower beds before inviting the entire village round," muttered Major Waddington, who stood stiffly by the sundial, tapping his walking stick with impatience. His greying moustache bristled with quiet disapproval. "Some of us value authenticity over fuss," replied Lionel Frame with a smirk, adjusting his bow tie with exaggerated precision. "It's meant to be a garden, not a showroom." Mr. Frame was a man of pomp and posture. A retired horticulturist, or so he claimed. He had recently moved to the village from Cheltenham, bringing with him a rare and slightly sour air of superiority. He spoke with clipped consonants and a faint condescension, and had made himself swiftly unpopular by criticizing nearly every garden he visited. Cecily winced visibly as Lionel raised his voice to announce, "These foxgloves are far too clustered. Classic sign of careless planting." And that wisteria choked, absolutely choked. Several villagers turned away in embarrassment. The vicar, visibly flustered, chuckled nervously and offered Lionel a plate of shortbread. Meanwhile, Rose Talbot arrived fashionably late. She strolled in with an effortless air of sophistication, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that cast her striking features into delicate shadow. She greeted Miss Marple and Dora with a quick, warm smile. "Apologies, darlings. Got caught in conversation with the Colonel's wife. She was rather concerned about slugs in her lettuces. Dreadfully serious matter." Miss Marple returned the smile, but said nothing. Rose Talbot, the newest addition to St. Mary Mead, had rented a cottage at the edge of the village 3 months earlier. No one quite knew what she did for a living, or why she had left London so suddenly, but she'd quickly won favour through her charm, her fashionable clothes, and her rather too perfect begonias. As the tea flowed and the chatter rose, tensions bloomed like weeds beneath the surface. "I must say," Lionel Frame barked again, now peering into a nearby flower pot, "some of these cuttings are positively mislabeled, false identities if you will. That pink begonia over there. Quite clearly Sophie, not Coral Charm." No one responded. Several guests deliberately moved away. Even Cecily's smile had become a tight, brittle thing. Miss Marple, however, observed Lionel closely. His tone, though pompous, carried something sharper beneath, something laced with provocation. He enjoyed the sting of criticism, and what's more, he seemed to revel in watching others squirm. She made a mental note of the way his gaze lingered on Cecily just a moment too long. At 4:30, the guests began to thin out. Crumbs and crumpled napkins lay abandoned on plates. The sun had dipped slightly, casting long golden shadows over the lawn. Reverend Denham offered a prayer of thanks, while Cecily collected the empty teacups with a mechanical grace. Miss Marple stood to leave. As she adjusted her shawl and smoothed the front of her skirt, she noticed something curious, a set of muddy footprints near the greenhouse door. Not quite fresh, but recent enough to suggest an unscheduled visit. She glanced up. The greenhouse door hung slightly ajar, its glass panels catching the last of the sun. No one else seemed to notice. "Well, Dora," she said quietly, "shall we take the scenic route home?" Dora nodded, still clutching half a sandwich. Lovely afternoon, wasn't it? Miss Marple's gaze flicked back to the greenhouse before she turned away. "Yes," she said softly. "Quite enlightening." Chapter 2. The sudden silence. The peace of a Sancta Mary Mead morning was broken not by the chirrup of birds or the clink of milk bottles, but by the shattering wail of Cecily Denham's voice piercing the air. By 7:30, the vicarage was swarming, not with birds or bees, but with blue-uniformed officers, a pair of ambulant constables, and one particularly grim-faced Inspector Cray, a narrow, angular man with thinning blonde hair and a tendency to sneer slightly when thinking. Inspector Cray was not fond of villages. He considered them quaint, overly polite places where truth was smothered in biscuits and alibis brewed stronger than the tea. Lionel Frame lay on the cold stone floor of the vicarage greenhouse, a shattered teacup beside him, and a spattered thermos not far off. His limbs were askew, one arm stretched out as though reaching toward the potting bench. His lips, blue and dry, curled slightly, almost as if in a final smirk. Miss Marple, summoned rather quickly by the distressed housemaid Alice, had arrived quietly, her small figure barely noticed amid the uniforms and flurry. She stood politely by the greenhouse gate, her eyes scanning every inch with calm attentiveness. Inspector Cray, upon noticing her, frowned. "Oh yes," he muttered under his breath. "The famous Miss Marple, and I suppose you've already solved it." Miss Marple gave him a gentle, unbothered smile. "Heavens, no. That would be most ungracious of me, Inspector. I only arrived a moment ago." Cray grunted. "Dead as a doornail. Early signs of poisoning. Our doctor suspects digitalis foxglove extract, quite potent and extremely unpleasant." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Foxglove? From a garden? From this garden? More than likely," Cray replied dryly. "The place is practically an apothecary. We found traces of it in the thermos. The tea inside seems to have been made fresh this morning. You're familiar with the deceased, I take it?" "Oh yes." Mr. Frame had quite an eye for other people's mistakes, and for ornamental alliums. And enemies?" "More than one," she replied simply. Cray raised an eyebrow. "So I've gathered." Cecily Denham, pale and visibly shaken, sat on a garden bench, wrapped in a wool shawl despite the warm morning sun. Her hands trembled as she clutched a handkerchief. The vicar stood protectively beside her, his brow deeply furrowed. "I served him the tea," Cecily whispered hoarsely, barely audible. "It was meant for Paul. I brought it out as I always do. He said he'd fetch his gloves from the greenhouse, and then I heard a crash." Miss Marple sat beside her and gently touched her elbow. "You always prepare the tea, dear?" "Yes," Cecily replied. "Every morning, 2 cups. I only brought one out this time. I was in a hurry. The other was still on the tray inside." "And the thermos?" Miss Marple inquired softly. "He liked his herbal blends," Cecily murmured. "Said the vicar's tea was too milky. He asked me for hot water last night and left the thermos on the garden table. I didn't think anything of it." Inspector Cray scribbled into his notebook. "So Mr. Frame prepared his own tea?" Cecily nodded. "As far as I know." Miss Marple sat quietly for a moment, then looked over to the greenhouse. The glass door had been left open, and the foxgloves swayed gently in the breeze just outside. A few gardening tools lay scattered on the workbench: spade, pruning shears, a broken pot. On the floor near the body, a fine trail of dark powder led to the base of a wooden crate. "Inspector," she said, thoughtfully, "may I suggest you examine the underside of that potting bench? Foxglove roots can be deceptively placed. Cray stared at her for a moment, then motioned to the constables. Inside, one of the officers crouched, lifted the edge of the bench, and called out, "Sir, there's a bundle wrapped in muslin. Looks like dried leaves." Cray muttered a curse. Convenient. Meanwhile, the villagers were already beginning to buzz. By mid-morning, word had spread as fast as rising steam over a kettle. The postmistress told Mrs. Weatherby it was suicide. Mrs. Weatherby swore it was murder, plain and simple. Martha, at the village shop, insisted she saw Rose Talbot near the vicarage earlier than usual, looking like she'd stepped out of a picture frame and up to no good. Miss Marple took her usual walk to the grocer around 11, humming lightly. At the shop she found Martha in full gossiping form. "Heard about Lionel?" Martha whispered, eyes wide. "Shocking, that dreadful man. Said my begonias were tawdry. Serves him right, some say." Miss Marple replied mildly, "How curious, though I do wonder. Didn't he recently purchase some very rare seeds?" Martha nodded vigorously. "Rose seeds? Yes. Paid £3 he did. Said they were the last of their kind." "Did he collect them?" Martha frowned. "Odd thing. He accused someone of swiping them, only 2 days ago. Made a bit of a scene about it in the post office." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And were they found?" "Wouldn't know. Didn't say." Stormed off muttering. Later that day, as Miss Marple passed her own garden gate, she paused. There, beside her prized rose bushes, she noticed a curious disturbance in the soil. A single muddy footprint, larger than her own, pressed lightly into the earth. She bent down, inspected it without touching, and stood again slowly. At the same time, a sound caught her ear, the unmistakable creak of a door. She turned just in time to see someone slipping out the back of Rose Talbot's cottage, clutching a cloth-wrapped bundle. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes slightly. It wasn't Rose, it was Major Waddington. He walked stiffly, favoring his bad leg, and disappeared into the side lane. Chapter 3 of Seeds and Secrets. The next morning arrived swathed in low mist, softening the outlines of roofs and hedges in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, wrapped in her rose-pink shawl, stood at her sitting-room window sipping her early tea. She watched as the fog lifted slowly, revealing the pale outlines of the vicarage, the spire of St. Clement's Church, and the thatched rooftops that made her village so picturesque and so deceitful. She turned thoughtfully to the small notebook she kept tucked beside her knitting basket. In it, she had written only one word: footprint. Below that, she added, Waddington. Limp, cloth bundle. 10:45. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had already planned her outing. She tucked a basket over her arm and set out toward the village shop, walking with a measured step. The lanes smelled of fresh earth and dew, and somewhere nearby, a gardener turned soil with rhythmic precision. At the shop, Martha was restocking shelves of tinned peaches and grumbling at a sack of flour. "Good morning, Martha," Miss Marple greeted warmly. "How lovely your delphiniums look. I noticed them through your front hedge." Martha beamed. "Thank you kindly, Miss Marple. Not like some people who just criticize without lifting a finger. I tell you, the way Mr. Frame carried on." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint sigh. "Yes, poor Mr. Frame. I understand he believed someone had stolen something from him recently." Martha nodded sharply. "That's right. Those rare rose seeds I told you about, from Argentina or somewhere, claimed someone slipped into his tool shed during the village film night and took them, accused 3 different people. Mr. Denton the cobbler, poor Mrs. Arkwright, and even young Lily from the post office. Did anyone see him plant them?" Miss Marple asked lightly, pretending to inspect a jar of jam. "No one I know, though he boasted he'd already started them in his cold frame." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Curious. I did take a walk past his garden the other day. I don't remember seeing anything new in the cold frame. Just a few sad-looking ferns and a pile of newspapers." Martha snorted. Wouldn't be the first time he lied. Miss Marple thanked her kindly and left with a tin of biscuits she hadn't planned on buying. Her next stop was the churchyard, where the grass grew thick and unruly along the older stones. A small wooden hut served as the gravedigger's shelter, and there she found young Tommy Hughes eating a jam sandwich and reading a comic. "Tommy," she said gently, "I wonder if I might ask you something." Tommy jumped, nearly dropping his sandwich. "Oh, good morning, Miss Marple," she smiled. "I'm looking into something rather dull, I'm afraid. I'm told someone was seen here rather late one evening last week, carrying a box." Tommy hesitated. "It wasn't me, I swear. I never thought it was. But perhaps you saw who it was." Tommy shifted, clearly enjoying the responsibility. "It was dark, but I saw a man, limped a bit, tall, had a big box, held it funny, like it was heavy." "Did he go near any of the graves?" "No, just over by the tool shed. I heard a scraping noise. He left after 10 minutes. Didn't see his face." "Thank you, Tommy. You've been most helpful." As Miss Marple made her way home, she thought carefully. A man with a limp, carrying something heavy, near the shed. And only one man in the village limped quite so distinctly. When she reached her front gate, she turned sharply and crossed the lane toward Rose Talbot's cottage. Miss Talbot answered the door, wearing a silk robe and a hurried expression. "Miss Marple, what a charming surprise. Do come in, if you don't mind a bit of disarray. I've just finished painting." Indeed, the scent of turpentine and orange blossoms filled the small front room. Miss Marple took a seat by the window, noting the fresh canvases leaning against the fireplace. Impressionistic flowers, painted in bold, confident strokes. But something else caught her eye. A pair of ladies' gardening gloves, soil-streaked, rested on the window-sill. "Have you been gardening, Miss Talbot?" Miss Marple asked, with mild curiosity. "Oh, not really. I just rearranged some pots. I detest weeds." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently. "Do you know, I rather admired your begonias at the garden tea. Remarkably early for such blooms." Rose blinked. "Oh, thank you. I brought in from London. Did Mr. Frame ever comment on them?" A pause. A flutter of hesitation. Rose sighed. "Yes. He recognized them, of course. Accused me of passing off hothouse plants as native. Said I should be disqualified if I entered the competition. But you know Lionel, always a bark to his bite. Did you know him before St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple asked. A longer silence now, then a soft, resigned nod. "Yes. We met in Chelsea, years ago. He was judging a city garden showcase. I was involved. There was a scandal. He claimed I forged entries, that I'd used another designer's layout. It wasn't true, but his word carried weight. I left quietly, reinvented myself, and now..." Rose drew in a deep breath. "He recognized me. Threatened to expose me to the Garden Society. Said he'd write to the council. I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I swear I didn't." Miss Marple looked at her gently. "Did you tell anyone else about your history with him?" "No, only Major Waddington. He'd guessed. He was kind." Miss Marple stood, collecting her shawl. "Thank you, my dear. One last thing, may I look at your roses out front? I noticed a rather unique color." "Oh, of course. They're called Lady Evangeline. Quite rare." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, kneeling beside the bush. And there, tucked beneath the foliage, she saw it, a small white tag, marked with tiny blue letters. FRM Variant 3. Test Batch. Miss Marple rose, her eyes unreadable. "How curious," she murmured. Chapter 4. Whispered Confessions. The next day brought grey clouds that drifted sluggishly over St. Mary Mead, casting a muted gloom across the village. The warmth of spring had briefly retreated, leaving behind a chill that clung to shawls and settled in bones. Even the birds sang less enthusiastically, as though they too sensed a change in the air. Miss Marple sat in her parlour beside the ticking clock, knitting needles clicking in steady rhythm, but her thoughts were far from her half-formed sleeve. On the mantel her small notebook remained open. This time her writing was slightly more deliberate. Eric Boddington, limp, graveyard box. Apple Cicely's tea, intended target. Rose passed with Lionel variant 3 tag in her garden. She tapped the end of her pen once, then rose and placed a call to Cecily Denham. "Dear," she said softly once Cecily answered, "I wonder if you might like to join me at the sewing circle this afternoon. It's small this week, just Mrs. Collier and Dora. Nothing too taxing." There was a pause, a quiet intake of breath on the line. "Ah, yes. Yes, Jane. That might be nice." At 3 o'clock, the church hall held its usual array of tea trays, wool bundles and gentle gossip. The women sat in a half-circle, their fingers busy with embroidery and knitwear, but their conversation unusually tentative. Cecily arrived with pale lips and drawn eyes. She wore a dull brown coat and carried her work basket as though it weighed far more than yarn and needles. Miss Marple welcomed her with warm familiarity. "So lovely you could come, my dear. Tea?" As the others talked quietly about a muddled charity raffle, Miss Marple poured Cecily's cup and gently said, "I remember your wedding quite clearly, Cecily. The flowers, the hymn choices, such taste, but I wonder, has your marriage been quite so peaceful?" Cecily blinked, her hands faltered in her knitting. Jane," she hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You always did see things others don't." Miss Marple said nothing, only offered a patient, knowing look. Cecily leaned closer. "Paul was different when we married, or I was different. I don't know anymore. He was gentle at first, idealistic, but then the vicarage came, the expectations, the pride. Somewhere along the way he changed." Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "You heard him arguing with Mr. Frame, didn't you?" A tiny nod. "2 nights before, in the study, Paul told Lionel to keep quiet, or he'd ruin everything. Lionel laughed at him. He always laughed, but it wasn't kind laughter, it was cruel. Afterwards, Paul said it was nothing, a misunderstanding. Did you believe him?" Cecily looked down at her lap. "No. Lionel had something on him, something dangerous." Miss Marple gently folded her hands in her lap. "Would you mind terribly if I looked at the vicar's library sometime? I noticed a rather rare book when I visited last." Cecily hesitated again. Then, to Miss Marple's surprise, she gave a faint nod. "If it helps, then yes." The following morning, Miss Marple made her polite visit to the vicarage under the pretense of discussing flowers for the Sunday altar. Reverend Denham greeted her in his usual formal manner, warm enough to satisfy propriety, but brisk beneath the surface. As Cecily disappeared into the kitchen to fetch tea, Miss Marple examined the bookcase. There, in the second row from the top, was the book Toxic Flora of England, Identification and Use, bound in green cloth. Its spine was faded and fraying. She reached for it delicately, opened it midway, and saw that the chapter on Digitalis Pietia foxglove had been torn out. A small stamp on the back-end paper caught the eye, property of St. Mary Mead, lending library. "Curious," she murmured aloud. Reverend Denham re-entered, just as she replaced the book. "Do you find gardening and theology overlap, Miss Marple?" "In many ways," she replied calmly. "Both require patience, both yield results, based on how well we know what we plant." He smiled thinly. "Indeed." When she left shortly after, Miss Marple paused outside the greenhouse again. This time, she walked slowly to the side of the structure, crouched down, and examined the drain pipe. Caught between the stones and earth was a damp scrap of muslin. She picked it up with her gloved fingers and sniffed it. A faint bitter scent lingered, something sharp, dry, and chemical. That evening, the peace was broken once more, though not by tragedy, but by fear. Cecily Denham, voice tight with panic, arrived at Miss Marple's doorstep just before sundown. "There's been an accident, or nearly one." Miss Marple ushered her inside. "Tell me." It was the hanging basket in the back courtyard. It fell, almost hit Paul, who was standing below it, tying his shoe. It missed him by inches. The hook was loosened. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. Was he alone? She asked. No, Cecily said quietly. Major Waddington had just left. They'd had an odd conversation about Lionel's will. Paul said he never mentioned one before. Miss Marple said nothing. Her thoughts whirred behind her serene expression. Later that night, she sat once again at her desk and wrote in her notebook, God of Theo. Book torn. Digitalis chapter missing. Basket. Accident. Too close. Waddington at Vicarage. At Roses. Frame seed batch. She folded the notebook and stared into the fire. Too many whispers, she murmured. But someone's voice is about to break. Chapter 5. Rose with Thorns. Rain pattered gently against the windows of Miss Marple's sitting room, the following morning veiling the village in a silvery haze. The usual clatter of bicycles and milk floats had softened to a hush, and the world outside seemed temporarily subdued, like a held breath. Miss Marple, however, was wide awake and already on her way to pay a visit. Rose Talbot answered the door in a navy wool jumper, her face paler than usual. Her eyes, so often filled with flirtatious defiance, now held something closer to caution. Miss Marple, she said flatly, I expected you sooner. I thought a day might soften your mood. Miss Marple replied gently. May I come in? Rose hesitated, then stepped aside without a word. The interior of the cottage was immaculate. Bowls of dried lavender lined the mantel, and a copper watering can gleamed beneath the coat rack. Everything was precise, too precise, perhaps. Miss Marple noticed the scent of polish, not soil. I found something yesterday, Miss Marple began calmly, settling into a floral armchair. A plant tag, in your rose bush, marked with Lionel Frame's coding. Rose exhaled sharply, but didn't flinch. I didn't kill him. Perhaps not, Miss Marple agreed, but you did plant his roses. A pause. Yes, Rose admitted. He gave them to me last week. Said he wanted to see how they took to different soil. I accepted because, well, I didn't want a scene. He enjoyed creating those. But you didn't tell the police. I didn't think it mattered. I knew how it would look, especially after our past. Miss Marple studied her. You've lived under another name before, haven't you? Yes. Rose looked away. In London I was Rachel Travers, a partner in a small landscape firm. Lionel accused me of copying a competitor's designs. It wasn't true, but it ruined me. He threatened to expose you here, Miss Marple guessed softly. Rose nodded. I moved here for quiet, for anonymity. He told me at the vicarage tea he recognized me. I panicked. I begged him not to say anything. He just smiled and said, I might forget if I find your planting impressive enough. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. And was it? He said he'd think about it. There was no mistaking the bitterness in her tone. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Tell me, what was your impression of Major Waddington? Rose blinked. Odd question. Why? Humor me. He was courteous, watchful. I felt he knew things he never said. He came by the cottage the day before the murder, asked me if Lionel had ever been in the war. And had he? No. Lionel loved uniforms, but never wore one. He told me once he dodged the draft with a doctor's note. How did the Major react? Rose tilted her head. He didn't. Just said, men like that don't last long around real danger. Then he left. Happy Miss Marple left the cottage soon after, the rain easing into a lazy drizzle. She walked the long way home, passing the graveyard again. Something about that earlier report from young Tommy still nagged at her. A man with a limp, a box, a scraping sound near the tool shed. She entered the churchyard through the side gate, and approached the shed. The door hung slightly ajar. Inside she found sacks of soil, a rusted trowel, a broken chair, and tucked beneath a canvas sheet, an empty wooden crate. But it wasn't the crate that caught her eye. It was the corner of a thick, folded envelope wedged beneath it. She pulled it free. On the front, in a harsh, angular scrawl, to be opened only in the event of my death. Lel F. Miss Marple's breath caught. Carefully she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "I know someone wants me gone. They've been following me for days. If anything happens, look to the vicar. He has more to hide than Sunday sermons." No signature, but the handwriting matched Lionel's garden tags. Neat, precise, and arrogant. Back in her parlor that afternoon, Miss Marple placed the letter gently beside her notebook. The storm had broken. Outside, birds resumed their song, oblivious to the brewing consequences. She had barely settled into her armchair when a knock came at the door. It was Major Waddington. He stood stiffly, soaked to the knees, eyes unusually anxious. "Miss Marple," he said with gruff urgency, "I need to speak with you, in private." She stepped aside without a word. Inside, he refused tea. He stood, arms rigid by his sides. "I know I've been watched," he began, "and I don't blame you. I watch everyone," she replied mildly. "I didn't kill Lionel," he said firmly, "but I know who might have, or why." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Go on. He ruined my son." That stopped her. "Your son?" she repeated softly. "Yes, Thomas. He worked under Lionel, at a botanical institute. Lionel plagiarized his work, took the credit. My son had a nervous breakdown and took his own life." Miss Marple said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes. "I came to St. Mary Mead when I heard Lionel had moved here. I admit I watched him. I thought about confronting him, but I never did. I couldn't bring myself to stoop that far. Then I saw others circling him too. The vicar, Miss Talbot, even Cecily too." Galt rose. "He wouldn't last around danger." He looked up. "Because he never did. He was a coward in every form. And the box you carried to the churchyard," he stiffened. "It contained papers, notes my son had written about Lionel's theft. I didn't want to bring them into this, too painful. But maybe it's time someone did." When he left, Miss Marple stood at the window for a long time. The village seemed calm, yet so many people had danced near the fire, and one had stepped through it. She picked up her notebook and turned to a fresh page. Lionel's warning letter points to vicar. Major's confession. Motive, but no action. Desem rose angry, threatened, but watched. Cecily. Fear, silence, deeper than expected. And then she underlined one final sentence. "The wrong tea may have gone to the right person." Chapter 6. A vicar's past. The spring sun returned the next morning, as if trying to make up for the storm it had sent before. But in St. Mary Mead, not all clouds had lifted. The village, though smiling on the surface, held its breath beneath the quiet, awaiting hush, heavy with things unspoken. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. Her mind, having clicked and whirred through the night, now worked with quiet certainty. She tidied her knitting basket, selected her blue hat with the velvet ribbon, and made her way to the vicarage once again. But this time her visit would not be about tea or tulips. Reverend Paul Denham was in his study when she arrived, his sleeves rolled, and his desk strewn with sermon notes. The room smelled faintly of ink, and the air held the weight of interrupted thought. "Miss Marple," he said politely, though his eyes flickered with something behind them. Tension, perhaps. "What a pleasure. Has Cecily forgotten something?" "No," she replied gently, "though I imagine she's forgotten a great deal over the years. Intentionally, perhaps. But I'm not here about Cecily. I'm here about Lionel Frame." The vicar's expression froze for half a second, just long enough. He set his pen down slowly. "What about him? You argued with him," she said calmly. "And not just one." "I believe we had a difference of opinion over his manner at the garden event," the vicar said carefully. "But hardly more." Miss Marple's voice remained even. "He knew about your past." The silence that followed was deafening. Reverend Denham folded his hands together. "What are you implying?" "Only that he may have had reason to threaten you," she said, eyes unwavering. "You see, I've read most of the parish bulletins since you arrived here, but one detail always struck me as odd. You never mention your academic training. The vicar stood slowly. Why should I? Because for a man once published in the Oxford Botanical Record, it seems an odd omission. His shoulders tensed. You've been digging. I prefer pruning, Miss Marple replied gently. Cleaner work. Reverend Denham turned to the window. Yes, I was a botanist once, long ago, before I took holy orders. And you left that life, she said softly, after a plagiarism scandal involving your mentor's research. He turned sharply. That was never proven, but Lionel Frame knew about it. He worked in those circles, likely saw your name struck off from the academic lists. He said he'd ruin me, Denham said hoarsely. Said he'd expose the truth. I begged him not to involve Cecily. She doesn't know. Miss Marple watched him with quiet pity. You tore pages from a library book on poisons. I did not kill him, he said at once. She didn't answer, just looked at him for a long, thoughtful moment. Back at home, Miss Marple took out the muslin bundle she had found under the greenhouse bench. Inside were foxglove leaves, dry, brittle, and carefully wrapped. A handwritten label in block capitals read, D. purpurea, dosage variable. Watch the steep. She placed it gently in a paper envelope and locked it in the drawer of her writing desk. The poison was prepared deliberately by someone who knew how to control it. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the local library. Mrs. Alden, the librarian, greeted her warmly. I wonder, Miss Marple asked, has anyone checked out Toxic Flora of England in the past month? Mrs. Alden consulted her record book. Yes, twice. Miss Frame borrowed it first. Then a week later someone returned it anonymously. It had torn pages. I'm afraid I had to take it off the shelves. Did you keep the return slip? Just the name of the last person to check it out. Miss Marple examined the entry. Frame, returned, 3rd April. But nothing after that. So someone had borrowed the book after him. Unofficially, by late afternoon, Miss Marple received another visitor. Sophia Merriman, the vicar's longtime neighbor and friend. She brought with her a basket of scones and a troubled expression. I thought you should see this, she said quietly, handing over a small silver bracelet. Miss Marple turned it in her hands. The engraving read, To my H. With love, D. Where did you find it? She asked. In my sitting room, Sophia said, tucked behind a cushion. It wasn't mine. I think Cecily must have dropped it when she visited 2 nights ago. Miss Marple's fingers stilled. Has Cecily ever mentioned the name Douglas? Sophia shook her head. No, but I always had the feeling there was something she never said. Miss Marple placed the bracelet carefully on her mantle. She's been holding something back, and I think it's about time we heard it. That night, the house at the end of Chapel Lane flickered with candlelight. Inside, Miss Marple sat by the hearth, as Cecily Denham poured tea with trembling hands. I found something today, Miss Marple said. A bracelet. It wasn't your husband who gave it to you, was it? Cecily didn't answer. Her face went pale. Cecily, Miss Marple said gently, you've been carrying this secret for years. You're not protecting Paul. You're protecting yourself. At last Cecily broke. It was Douglas Merriman, she whispered. Sophia's brother. We were engaged before Paul, but he left me, said he wasn't ready. I married Paul, out of grief, out of defiance. She covered her face, and Lionel Frame, he knew. He recognized the bracelet at the garden tea. He smiled and said, now there's a story worth digging up. I was terrified he'd tell Sophia. Miss Marple's voice was kind, but firm. Did you prepare the tea that morning, knowing Lionel might drink it? Cecily's hands trembled. I made Paul's tea. I always do. But the thermos, Lionel brought it in himself. I never touched it. Miss Marple believed her, but someone had touched it. Suppum see. Later, as Miss Marple returned home beneath the violet hues of dusk, she felt the edges of the puzzle beginning to take shape. Every thread led to the same tangled root. She opened her notebook and wrote, take a poison known to Vicar. Motive for Cecily: emotional, not fatal. Unravel: from feared death. Left note at bracelet, the blackmail, thermos, key. Who handled it last? She paused, then underlined one name twice: Arthur Waddington. Chapter 7. Drawing Room Shadows. The drawing room of the vicarage had been arranged with deliberate neatness. Teacups gleamed on their saucers, a fire crackled gently in the hearth, despite the mild weather, and chairs had been placed with uncomfortable symmetry like a stage set for a play where no one knew their lines. At precisely 6:30, the guests arrived, summoned not with urgency, but with a quiet insistence only Miss Marple could manage. The atmosphere was tightly wound, polite, brittle, expectant. Arthur Waddington stood near the fireplace, leaning heavily on his cane. His gaze flicked toward the window every few moments. Rose Talbot, her expression unreadable, perched on the edge of a wingback chair, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Cecily Denham sat close to the vicar, her shoulders drawn, while Reverend Denham himself appeared composed, too composed. Miss Marple noted. Sophia Merriman stood near the door, arms folded, eyes shifting between the group. Miss Marple entered last. She placed a small wicker basket on the side table and took her seat, knitting in hand but untouched. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice calm. "I believe we owe it to Lionel Frame to understand exactly what happened to him." No one responded. The silence that followed was not merely quiet. It was loaded. She lifted a folded letter from the basket. This was found hidden in the churchyard shed. It's a note penned by Mr. Frame. In it, he writes that he feared for his life. He specifically named the vicar as someone with more to hide than Sunday sermons. The room tensed. Paul Denham's jaw twitched. "That is a slanderous accusation." Miss Marple raised a hand, gently. "He was not wrong to believe he was in danger, Reverend. And while your past may have given Mr. Frame leverage, I don't believe you poisoned him." A subtle shift occurred across the room. Waddington narrowed his eyes. She turned towards Cecily. Nor do I believe Cecily was capable of such premeditation. Her motive was emotional, tied to shame, not revenge. Cecily looked down, her eyes glistening. Miss Marple continued, her tone even. "Miss Talbot, you had the motive, the means, and the knowledge. You had a history with Lionel. He humiliated you professionally, threatened your new life, and gave you his own roses. Ironically, the evidence that tied you to him. Yet you did not kill him either." Rose exhaled sharply, but without relief. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "That brings me to one remaining figure, a man who lost far more than pride, a father who watched his son's reputation destroyed by Lionel Frame's theft, a soldier who believes in honor and punishment." Major Waddington straightened. "I never touched that tea." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But you tampered with something else. The thermos." He hesitated. "I found muslin soaked in foxglove concentrate hidden beneath the bench in the greenhouse," she said. "Wrapped carefully, dated, labeled with dosage instructions. It was not a random poisoning. It was prepared, stored, ready." He didn't speak. "You knew Lionel used that thermos each morning. You watched him, waited, and when he left it out on the garden table the night before when no one was looking, you injected the dose into the lid. The room was silent. He steeped his tea in it. The next morning, thinking it safe, but the poison had already seeped into the liquid. It was slow, deliberate, and deadly." At last Waddington spoke. "You're very clever, Miss Marple, but you can't prove it." "No," she said softly. She reached into her basket and placed a small silver object on the table, a button. "This came from your coat. It was found beneath the potting shelf, along with a muddy impression, same size as your boot." Waddington stared at it. His fingers tightened around the head of his cane. "Do you know what it's like," he said slowly, "to watch your son fall apart, to see his work stolen, his name disgraced, and the man responsible still swanning around criticizing geraniums and sipping tea?" Miss Marple listened without judgment. I wanted him to feel fear, Waddington said quietly, the way my son did, but Lionel never feared anything, not until the end. Rose whispered, you used us all as cover. He turned toward her. Yes. You had motive. So did Cecily. So did the vicar. I let Lionel do what he always did, alienate everyone. He made himself an easy target. Inspector Cray, who had been quietly standing in the corner at Miss Marple's request, now stepped forward. That's all I needed, he said quietly. Waddington looked at him. I won't resist, Cray nodded. I didn't think you would. As he was led out, Waddington paused at the door and glanced back at Miss Marple. I don't regret it, he said, but I wish it hadn't been necessary. She met his eyes. It never is, Major. That's the trouble with revenge. It always grows in poisoned soil. Chapter 8. The Last Bloom. 1 week after the arrest, the vicarage garden stood oddly silent. Where once voices had chattered over teacups, and criticisms flew like bees around blossoms, now only the breeze disturbed the petals. The foxgloves still stood tall, a little too proud, their beauty untainted by the poison they had come to represent. Miss Marple sat in the garden once more, alone this time, her shawl wrapped firmly around her shoulders despite the soft warmth of the sun. She sipped her tea slowly and watched as Cecily Denham moved among the flower beds, with quiet purpose, her hands muddy but sure. The garden, for all its secrets, had survived. You've kept it well, Miss Marple called gently. Cecily looked up, her face drawn but calmer. I had to. It's the only thing I can control now. Will you stay? Miss Marple asked. For a while, Cecily said. Paul and I have distance now. He's gone to stay with his brother in Norfolk. I think we both need time. The truth wounded us both, but not fatally. Miss Marple nodded. Wounds often need light to heal. Cecily returned to her work. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the roses along the path, fresh, red, blooming as if no tragedy had touched them. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way through the village, nodding to neighbors who stopped to offer cautious greetings. She passed the library, the church, the bakery, and finally turned into the path leading to Rose Talbot's cottage. Rose met her on the threshold, a cup of tea already in hand. I owe you more than thanks, Rose said quietly. I could have been accused. I was suspected. You carried your own weight of secrets, Miss Marple replied. But you never let it bury you. That's something. I'm leaving, Rose said suddenly. I've received an offer from a garden magazine in Sussex. Editor's position. A chance to start over properly, under my real name. Miss Marple smiled. Then perhaps Lionel gave you a gift after all. Rose blinked, then chuckled softly. You always say the most unexpected things. That's because people rarely listen closely enough to say the obvious. They parted at the gate with a warm handshake. No promises, just mutual respect. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a short letter to her niece in London. She wrote slowly, in a tidy hand, Dearest Raymond, another little storm has passed here in St. Mary Mead. A man is dead, and another has admitted to murder, though I dare say it was grief that did the real work long before any poison was brewed. It began, as many such things do, with pride and silence. Mr. Frame wielded his knowledge like a blade. He hurt people and enjoyed it, but I don't think he ever believed anyone would strike back. Major Waddington's confession revealed more than guilt. It exposed a very human sorrow. I believe he saw the poison as justice. But justice rarely grows well from such soil. Cecily has taken up the garden again. Paul has retreated, which I think wise. And Miss Talbot, well, I rather admire her for choosing honesty over convenience. As for me, I shall return to my knitting and allow the geraniums to be the loudest drama in my life. With love, Aunt Jane. She folded the letter and placed it in the post box by the lane, pausing to glance once more toward the vicarage. All around her, spring rolled on undisturbed, indifferent to secrets, unmoved by justice, unbothered by memory. But Miss Marple remembered. She always did, and as she walked home beneath the glowing blush of sunset, she carried the comfort of quiet resolution with her, like a shawl wrapped snugly against the fading chill.